Welcome, everyone, to Hatfield House, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Vanice Jones-Rahi. I'm the head of Archives and Collections here, and I'm really pleased to be welcoming you to the first lecture of our 2026 series. Before we start, though, I just want to mention, can you please refrain from any filming or photography during the event tonight? And also, we're not expecting a fire alarm, so if one does go off, just exit the building via the north doors where you came in. So we are starting the Hatfield Park lecture series this year with this exhibition and panel on the remarkable women of the Tudor era. I hope you had the opportunity earlier this evening to view the exhibition put on by the Archives and Collections team in the Armory. But if you haven't, don't worry, there will be an opportunity at the end of the panel. The exhibition features some of the Tudor women who appear in the Hatfield House Library and Archive collections, including those who the panel will discuss today, but also important Cecil women, including Mildred Cook Cecil, who is not only William Cecil's wife, but also an accomplished scholar, patron, and Cecil's confidant, and Elizabeth Cecil, Robert Cecil's wife, and Lady of the Bedchamber to Elizabeth I. We are extremely fortunate here at Hatfield to hold the Cecil papers in our archives. So these are the papers of William Cecil, the first Baron Burghley, and Robert Cecil, the first Earl of Salisbury, both of whom were chief ministers to Queen Elizabeth I. In this collection, we see intimate details of Elizabeth's reign and the inner workings of the state during the late Tudor period, but also earlier papers which evidence Katherine Parr's life as Henry VIII's queen and later widow, and Elizabeth's tumultuous teenage years, which you'll hear about this evening, and actually in the exhibition. We do also find in these papers glimpses, though, into the personal lives of William and Robert Cecil and the women who surrounded them and supported them. So do take some time after the talks this evening to take a closer look at the exhibition and the evidence of the substantial mark that these women have made on history. So our panel this evening, sometimes known themselves as the Tudor Trio, are going to explore female relationships as friends, family, and sometimes rivals in the Tudor period, featuring some incredibly influential women, including Anne Boleyn, Katherine Parr, and Elizabeth I. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker this evening, Kate McCaffrey. Kate is castle historian and assistant curator at Hever Castle in Kent, and she's also currently completing her Chase-funded doctorate at the University of Kent. She has co-curated 3 exhibitions, co-authored 4 books, and appeared on multiple television shows, documentaries, and podcasts. In 2024, she was named by BBC History Extra as one of their 30 under 30 historians to watch. Kate will be speaking to us this evening about Anne Boleyn's female friendships and how her circle of friends kept her legacy alive following her untimely death. Over to you, Kate.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Vanice, for the kind introduction. It's an honour to be here this evening alongside the brilliant Nicola and Owen to form a panel to discuss Tudor women and to accompany the wonderful exhibition of Hatfield archival treasures that Vanice has curated. The common themes of our panel today are the ideas of female relationships and agency and influence. The women of the 16th century highlighted throughout this evening were all highly educated, opinionated, intellectually active, politically aware women who perhaps did not fit the Tudor ideal of passive womanhood, but who continue to inspire today precisely because of their individuality. As Venice mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you this evening about one of the most controversial Tudor women out there, both in her lifetime and still 500 years later, the second queen of Henry VIII and the mother of Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn. More specifically, I'm going to be sharing with you some of my research into Anne Boleyn's vastly understudied network of female friendships, revealing a community of women who bravely kept her name and story alive in the years after her downfall. In exploring these intergenerational stories of female solidarity and loyalty with regards to Anne's life and legacy, I hope to encourage all of us to re-examine how we see Anne herself and how we view early modern female friendships more generally. So when we remember Anne Boleyn today, we tend to remember a queen surrounded by power, scandal, betrayal, ambition. The narrative of Anne Boleyn's life has been shaped over centuries by predominantly male historians, chroniclers, and dramatists who focused almost exclusively on her relationships with men. Most notably, of course, with Henry VIII, but also with the men who supposedly used her as a pawn for their own ambitions at court. So people like her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Or Anne is remembered in relation to the men associated with her scandalous downfall, such as Thomas Cromwell, and those who were accused of adultery and treason alongside her, so Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and of course her beloved brother George. Rarely do we pause to ask, where were the women in Anne's life, outside perhaps of her mother Elizabeth and her sister Mary? Who remained loyal to Anne in her story, if anyone? And perhaps more importantly, why have their voices been erased or sidelined? There's a long-standing assumption in traditional history that Anne had no close female friends whatsoever, or at the very least that her female relationships were either superficial or riddled with a kind of rivalry and suspicion. This idea is deeply rooted in patriarchal historiography, and when we question it, it's revealing both about Anne's legacy and also more broadly about how historical narratives are constructed, particularly when powerful women are involved. A powerful woman could not also be a warm and beloved friend. She had to be cold, calculating, and ultimately alone. In Anne's case, this made her downfall easier to explain and more morally satisfying for audiences who were, at this time, primed to see ambitious women punished. The sexual allegations at the heart of Anne's fall, adultery and incest, further served to isolate her in our historical imagination. These are crimes tied to male relationships, but they also carry those heavy connotations about female impropriety and betrayal. Remembered for centuries as the concubine or the other woman in Henry VIII's relationship with his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, the Anne of history has never been seen as a girl's girl. And today, I would like to challenge that. I'd like to assert that although Anne undoubtedly did have important relationships with men, her husband, her family, members of her court, Anne was not without female friends. And in fact, she cultivated and maintained a close-knit network of female friendships. She was an active part of a female community, and this community, although powerless to intercede during her unjust downfall, ensured her memory stayed alive through to the future reign of her daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. So without further ado, I will move on to some of the specific women who have emerged from my research as friends and champions of Anne. My initial research revolved around one specific piece of evidence, a book of hours or a traditional Catholic scriptural prayer book that was once owned and inscribed by Anne herself. This book is held today in Hever Castle's collection, but was originally printed by a man named Germain Hardouin in Paris in 1527. Inside its pages, Anne wrote the poignant rhyming couplet, which you can see here in her hand. Remember me when you do pray, that hope doth lead from day to day. Prior to my close study of this volume, it had largely been overlooked in scholarship, and so the evidence I uncovered was particularly exciting. I was able to recover 4 further inscriptions written inside the book that had later, at an unknown date, been erased. And these inscriptions allowed me to piece together the path that this book took in the years after Anne's ownership, and so reveal the predominantly female hands who kept this book, which is a critical piece of Anne's material legacy, safe. So I'll show you those inscriptions now. This is what they look like to the naked eye. They appear almost like smudges or water damage, but on closer inspection, you can start to see the outline of words beneath the smudging. And this felt like real historical detective work to me. I had my magnifying glass and my goggles. It was amazing. I was able to use ultraviolet light technology to illuminate the erasures and then photo editing software to try and peel back the layers of fuzz around each letter until I was left with something that was almost legible, like this. These are the same two inscriptions under UV light. And as you can see, it really does help to bring forth the words from the page, although I admit it still took me months to decipher what they said. Unfortunately, full transcriptions for each note remain at this point elusive, thanks to the vigour of the erasures. But what has happened is I've been able to uncover the signed names of each inscription, and that's what's allowed me to reconstruct the networks of ownership and friendship that this book passed through. 4 out of 5 of the inscriptions in the book were written by women. And so what emerges at this point in the book's life is its assumption of a gendered identity. This book became the well-used and loved symbol of a community of interconnected links of local Kent gentrywomen as a sign of close kin and friendship. So to go through the inscriptions I uncovered, first, the fully legible inscription here is signed by a name that appears to be Elizabeth Shirley. Next, there is an inscription which seems to be signed by John Gage. Another inscription from this family appears to be signed by Philippa Gage. And finally, the last note in the book was signed by a Mary West. Now, this is where I did some lengthy research into surnames in the inscriptions involving lots of family trees, so please do bear with me here because it's important to see how all of these people connect together and then connect to Anne. Most simply put, the people who wrote inside Anne's book after her all revolve around a broadly linked tree of connections between the Gage family, the Shirley family, and the West family, who in turn all revolve around the children of Sir Richard Guildford of Cranbrook in Kent and his first wife, Anne Pimp. The Wests were the most noble and titled of this group of families, holding the baronies of West and De La Warr, although Guildford and 2 of his sons enjoyed successful court careers as close friends of Henry VIII. You may recognise the names of Sir Edward Guildford, whose daughter Jane married John Dudley, the future first Duke of Northumberland, and Sir Henry Guildford, who was the comptroller of Henry VIII's household, as well as his master of horse. Both the Wests and the Guildfords, however, were largely based in their own counties and not at court, meaning that this book stayed safe away from the prying eyes and heat of court after Anne's downfall. But back to the family tree, Guildford's eldest son, Edward, first married Eleanor West, the daughter of Thomas West, 8th Baron de la Warr, and they had a daughter, Jane, who I just mentioned went on to marry her parents' ward, John Dudley, and whose son, Robert, would become the love of Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth's life. Jane is, I believe, a likely recipient of Elizabeth Shirley's inscription, which she dedicates to her niece, Jane. Another Guildford son, George, married Elizabeth Mortimer, a granddaughter of John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and so a relation of Anne Boleyn through her mother. Their daughter, Mary, married Owen West and is likely the author of the inscription signed Mary West. Guildford's daughter, Philippa, married Sir John Gage, who are both likely authors of those other 2 inscriptions. And Gage was a distinguished politician at the courts of both Henry VIII and later Queen Mary I. And famously, interestingly enough, he was vocally not a Boleyn supporter, and I will come back to the significance of that. Finally, another of Guildford's daughters, Elizabeth, married first Thomas Isley of Sundridge and second Richard Shirley of Wiston. This very much seems, therefore, to be the Elizabeth Shirley of the inscription, and she is an important woman in this story. The next question, of course, is how did the book get from Anne's hands into the hands of this big extended family? Now, I believe that Anne passed her book to a lady at court, and likely a childhood acquaintance and friend named Elizabeth Hill. Although the book does not have an inscription by anyone named Elizabeth Hill, Hill was the daughter of Elizabeth Shirley, who we know did write in the book. And it seems likely to me, therefore, that after Anne passed the book to Hill, Hill passed the book to her mother, who in turn shared the book with other trusted members of her family. Now, Elizabeth Hill was not a prominent noblewoman. She came from a provincial family, and she was married at this time to Richard Hill, who was the head of the king's cellar. However, there are multiple sources which locate her as a gentlewoman at court whilst Anne was queen. For example, she appears in the 1534 New Year's gift roll as Mrs. Hills, wife of the sergeant of the cellar. And even more interesting for her connection to Anne, Hill was raised in Sundridge, only 8 miles away from Anne's childhood home at Hever, and so very likely knew Anne from years before she shot to the heights of power at court. If the book was gifted this way, it really demonstrates a close and trusted friendship between Anne and her attendant, Elizabeth Hill, who was likely someone that, as Anne found herself in that increasingly isolated role at court, she could trust from knowing in childhood. Now, sadly, because they were women and women who were middling gentry who lived largely in the provinces, none of the authors of the female inscriptions in Anne's books had much recorded about their lives, and so they're difficult to grasp in that multidimensional colour that I would love to see them in. As you'll see from my slides, there were no images of them that survived to the present day, or, to be honest, were ever likely recorded during their lifetime. And so we have to somewhat see them through the men in their lives who were recorded in greater detail. What we can tell, though, are that Elizabeth Shirley and Philippa Gage were close, loving sisters who kept up a relationship throughout their lives. We know they were closest to their nieces, Mary West and the future Jane Dudley. So this family seems to have valued female connection and sought to strengthen those bonds through the gifting and sharing of items of significance to them, such as this Book of Hours. What is clear is that this prayer book and Anne's inscription inside it were kept safe in the private hands of those who once strongly valued a personal relationship with Anne. They are living proof of female friendship, and it's thanks to those women that this book survives today. To strengthen this argument, let me return very briefly to Sir John Gage, who I mentioned was quite anti-Boleyn in sentiment and very Catholic in his personal religion. And he was not the only man in these families to be so naturally opposed to Anne and what she represented. Richard Shirley and Thomas West were both also staunch Catholics and so natural allies of Catherine of Aragon, not Anne Boleyn. Gage himself is the best example, though, because in January 1534, the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis reported that, and I quote, "Gage, one of the wisest and most experienced in war of the whole kingdom, has renounced his office and gone to the Charter House in protest." And this was a protest at the king and Anne's treatment of Catherine of Aragon and the Princess Mary. Gage didn't return to court until after Anne's execution. So why would he and his family have kept a book bearing Anne's name and inscription safe? I think it's particularly telling that Anne's signed inscription survived despite the religious preferences of the families who owned the book after her. And I offer that this can be explained by the very fact that these books were largely used not by the men of the family, but by the women. It was these women who had, at some point, enjoyed and cherished a personal connection to Anne, one that transcended political or religious alliance and one that was honoured by preserving her name. This was a case of personal loyalty and friendship shining stronger than religious or political affiliation. which to me only strengthens the connections that these women must have felt towards Anne. So before my part of this panel comes to an end, I want to return quickly to Elizabeth Hill, who is one of the women in Anne's network to whom we can attach a bit more knowledge, and one to whom we can draw a poignant and relevant connection. After Richard Hill's death, Elizabeth married again, this time to a man named Sir John Mason, who was a successful scholar, diplomat, and spy. On marrying him, Elizabeth became Lady Mason, and she seems to have been wily, intelligent, and ambitious, perhaps qualities that drew her and Anne Boleyn together in friendship. Another quality she shared with Anne was her great love for her daughter, who was called Mary. After Anne Boleyn's death, Elizabeth Hill actually went to great pains to arrange for her daughter Mary to join Anne's daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth's young household, which poignantly began a lifelong friendship between the two daughters of these once fast friends. Mary went on to marry Elizabeth's childhood tutor, Sir John Cheek, and she became Lady Cheek. And when Elizabeth ascended to the throne, she appointed Lady Cheek as a lady of her privy chamber, and the two remained close all the way through until Elizabeth's death in 1603. I think it likely, seeing as we know that Anne's Book of Hours was kept safe in the hands of Mary Cheek's family, that when it was safe for her to do so, perhaps when Elizabeth was established on her throne and was seeking out ways to feel closer to her mother, as we know that she did, that Mary showed Elizabeth Anne's prayer book and allowed her to gaze upon the signed note inside. This would have made sense from a sign of personal friendship, but also from a sign of enduring political loyalty to Elizabeth and her family. We see these patterns of friendship between Anne and her contemporaries mapped onto the friendships between Anne's daughter Elizabeth and her contemporaries again and again. And that again is a powerful reminder of the enduring strength of female friendship at this time. So to summarize, I hope that this talk has introduced some new names to you and helped to demonstrate that Anne Boleyn operated in a complex but highly connected network of women. She was a multifaceted, intelligent woman living in an age that feared that. And she was friends with multifaceted, intelligent women who, in real acts of bravery and defiance against their king, against their husbands, chose to courageously keep Anne's books and notes and name safe in the years after her unjust execution. If we choose to see Anne only through the eyes of the men who despised or desired her, we miss the full picture. But if we widen that lens, if we look for the voices of the women who were silenced by time, women who loved and cared for Anne but who didn't fit that narrative of a stony and isolated queen, we find a richer, more emotive, more human story. A story not just of scandal and downfall, but of community and connection. And also, crucially, a story of intergenerational friendship that sustained not just Anne, but her daughter Elizabeth as they both navigated those uncharted waters as women carving out space for themselves in a world still hostile to female rule. We see Anne's legacy in all senses, I think, most clearly in her daughter. And Elizabeth grew into a ruler who understood the value of trust, loyalty, and carefully cultivated companionship amongst the women of her own court. And it is at places like here at Hatfield House that this continuity feels almost tangible. As we know, it was here that Elizabeth learned of her accession to the throne, stepping from uncertainty to authority. And in that moment, we can only imagine the invisible threads connecting mother and daughter. Anne's world of alliances and friendships shaping, in part, the woman that Elizabeth became and the court that she would later define. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's such an incredible discovery. And it's amazing how such such tiny annotations that could easily be overlooked have helped you to unpick this network of female friendships and to build this whole story as well. That's incredible. We're going to fast forward a little bit, just a tiny bit, to another of Henry VIII's wives now. Owen is going to speak to us, Owen Emerson, who is a social and cultural historian, author, and consultant. Like Kate, he's also part of the curatorial team at Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home. In 2024, he worked as one of the historical consultants for the BBC adaptation of Dame Hilary Mantle's Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light. Owen was also part of the research teams that identified the Book of Hours depicted in Hans Holbein the Younger's portrait of Thomas Cromwell in 2023, and a miniature portrait of Queen Mary I as princess by Susanna Horenbout in 2024. He is the co-author of several books and has contributed to numerous television documentaries, including The Boleyns, A Scandalous Family on BBC Two, and Holbein's The Ambassadors. Owen is going to be speaking to us this evening about Katherine Parr's influence, education, and faith during the reign of Henry VIII and beyond. Over to you, Owen.
Thank you so very much for that lovely introduction, and what an act to follow. Thank you, Kate. It's a real pleasure to be here at Hatfield. I do work at Hever Castle, but a lot of the time we spend in an office and in archives, and in those moments history can often feel distant, almost abstract. But when you are in a place like this, it feels close enough to touch. Hatfield is one of those places, not just because it's a grand house, which it is, but it is a place deeply bound up with the life of one of the most remarkable women in English history, Elizabeth I. A woman who did not simply pass through here, but lived here, learned here, and in many ways became herself here. And we are standing quite deliberately in the Great Hall in front of one of the most extraordinary images ever created of her, the so-called rainbow portrait. Now, this is not a portrait that invites casual viewing. It demands attention. The longer you look at it, the more it reveals. The eyes and ears embroidered into her clothing, suggesting that she sees and hears everything, that she knows everything. The rainbow in her hand, accompanied by that striking motto, "No rainbow without the sun, no peace without her." This is not a likeness. It's a performance. It's a statement. It is power translated into an image. Indeed, the groundbreaking research that I had the joy of seeing being revealed here last year suggests that it was likely not painted during her lifetime. And what I want to suggest to you today is that this extraordinarily confident image and the confidence in symbolism and in communication did not emerge in isolation. It was learned, it was shaped, and it was inherited. And at the center of that inheritance stands a woman who is too often overlooked, and that is Katherine Parr. Katherine Parr is so often introduced in rather modest terms: the last wife, the one who survived, the queen who kept her head down, quite literally, and made it through. And of course, there is truth in that. Survival at the court of Henry VIII was no small achievement. But it is also a deeply misleading way to understand Katherine, because she is not just interesting because she survived Henry VIII. She's interesting because she shaped the world that came after him. So today I want to reframe Katherine, not as a final chapter in Henry VIII's story, but as the beginning of something else, as the woman who connects two of the most famous figures in Tudor history, Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I. What Anne began, Katherine sustained. What Katherine shaped, Elizabeth inherited. And here is the key point. Without Katherine Parr, the world that produced Gloriana, Queen Elizabeth I, looks extraordinarily different, perhaps even unrecognisable. And standing here at Hatfield, where Elizabeth lived and where she learned, where she thought, we're not simply in a place connected to her life. We're in a place that reflects the success of Katherine Parr's influence. We're standing in the afterlife of her ideas. Now, to understand this point properly, we need to go back before Katherine and back to Anne. Anne is one of those figures who has almost been overwhelmed by her own story, the drama of her rise, the intensity of that relationship with Henry VIII, and of course the shock of her fall. And of course there is an element of the sheer brutality of her end too. It's a narrative so compelling that it has in many ways taken over. It's become the way we understand her. But if we look a little more closely, if we step slightly outside of that dramatic arc, we begin to see something else. We begin to see Anne not simply as a figure of romance or tragedy, but as Kate has beautifully illuminated, as a participant in one of the most significant intellectual and religious shifts of the 16th century. Because Anne Boleyn was not operating in isolation. She was part of a network, a circle of individuals who were engaged seriously, thoughtfully, with the religious changes taking place across Europe. Now, Anne was not a theologian in a formal sense. She was not writing treatises or committing her ideas to books, but she was highly influential. She was interested, and perhaps more importantly, she was positioned at the very center of power. And that really matters, because ideas on their own can exist quietly for a long time. But when they enter the court, when they move in the orbit of the king, they begin to have consequences. Anne encouraged the circulation of religious texts in English. She supported the reading of scripture in the vernacular. She was closely associated with figures like Thomas Cranmer, who would go on to play a central role in the English Reformation. And she helped to create an environment in which reformist ideas could be discussed, however fragile. And this is important because it changes the tone of the court. It creates a space where new ways of thinking about religion can emerge. And for a time, that space held. Reform became visible. It became something that could be spoken about, engaged with, even cautiously supported. But it was fragile. And Anne's fall in 1536 exposed just how fragile it really was. Because when Anne fell, she did not fall alone. The atmosphere she helped to create collapsed with her. The space for reform didn't disappear entirely, but it contracted. It became more cautious, more uncertain, and indeed more dangerous. Those who continued to support reformist ideas had to do so carefully and quietly, with an acute awareness of the ground beneath them no longer being stable. And Henry VIII himself does not resolve this tension. If anything, he embodies it. He has broken with Rome, yes, but he retains many traditional beliefs. He can support reform in one moment and resist it in the next. He can elevate reformist thinkers and then allow others to fall. So what we're left with in the years after Anne's death is not a clear direction. It's not a straightforward march toward reform. It's something much more complicated, a landscape of shifting alliances, of competing ideas, of great uncertainty. And within that landscape, reform survives, but it survives in a different way, not as something bold and visible as Anne made it, but as something quieter, more careful and more strategic. The flame nurtured by Anne is still there, but it flickers. And it needs someone not necessarily to ignite it again, but to protect it, to sustain it, to fuel and to reshape it. And that is where Katherine Parr enters the story. Katherine was born into the northern gentry, the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, a woman who had served in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was born into a household that valued education, particularly for its daughters, and she grew into a woman of notable learning and linguistic ability. Before she ever came to court as a queen, she had already been married twice, first to Edward Burr and then to John Neville, Lord Latimer, a union that drew her into the political and religious tensions of the North, including the upheavals of the Pilgrimage of Grace. By the time she met King Henry VIII, she was not an inexperienced young bride. She was a twice widowed gentlewoman of a clear sense of the world and how precarious it could be. When Catherine married Henry in 1543, she stepped into a court that is, in many ways, still incredibly unsettled. Not unstable in an obvious dramatic sense, but unsettled beneath the surface. Because the great rupture with Rome has already happened, the authority of the Pope has already been rejected. But what that actually means in practice is still being worked out. And it's being worked out in an environment that is anything but straightforward. Henry VIII is not a reformist king. He is not moving steadily in one direction. He is instead deeply contradictory. He can support reformist thinkers like Thomas Cranmer, and in the same time uphold deeply traditional doctrine. He can encourage change and then utterly resist it. He can allow debate and then punish it, which means that anyone operating successfully within his court has to be a weather vane to change, wind shifted by the temperament of a fundamentally contradictory and increasingly tempestuous tyrant king. And Katherine Parr understands this almost immediately. She's not new to court life. She's well-educated, well-connected, and politically aware. But more than that, she is intellectually engaged. She's not simply interested in religion as a matter of convention or duty. She's interested in it as a system of ideas. She reads, she thinks, she discusses, and crucially, she aligns herself carefully with reformist thought. She forms connections with individuals who are part of reformist networks. Her household becomes a place where religious texts are read and discussed, where ideas circulate, where intellectual life is taken seriously. And this is where Catherine starts to do something very important indeed. She does not reignite reform in the bold, visible way that Anne Boleyn did. Instead, she stabilizes it. She creates an environment in which reformist ideas can persist quietly, carefully, but persistently. And that is a very different kind of achievement because it requires a different set of skills. It requires restraint. It requires judgment. It requires an acute awareness of where the boundaries lie and how close one can come to them without crossing them. And Catherine walks that line with an almost remarkable precision. But this, of course, is not without risk. There does come a moment, one of the most dramatic in her life, when that balance begins to falter. By the mid-1540s, tensions within Henry's court were becoming more pronounced. There are factions, there are divisions, there are individuals who are deeply suspicious of reformist ideas and of those who support them. And Catherine, by this point, is no longer simply a quiet presence. She's known. She is recognized as someone who engages with religious debate. She is incredibly visible, and that visibility makes her vulnerable. At one point, accusations begin to gather around her. There are suggestions, dangerous suggestions, that she has gone too far, that her discussions of religion are not merely intellectual, but potentially subversive, that she is, in effect, stepping beyond what is considered appropriate. And in the world of Henry VIII's court, that is a very serious position to be in. A warrant is drawn up, plans are made, the possibility of arrest is real. Now, this is the moment when, in many stories, everything unravels. This is where the reformist queen is exposed, condemned, and destroyed. It would fit the pattern of what we have already seen. It would echo Anne Boleyn's fate. But that is not what happens. And it does not happen because Katherine Parr understands the situation she is in. She understands the nature of Henry VIII. She understands that this is not simply about theology, it's about perception. And so she responds not with defiance, but with a strategy. There is a moment where she approaches Henry and reframes her intellectual engagement. She presents her discussions not as challenges, but as acts of deference, as opportunities to learn from him, a way of acknowledging his authority. Now, whether every detail of that moment unfolded exactly as later accounts describe is still open to debate. But the essence of it is clear. Katherine Parr survives because she knows how to reposition herself. She knows how to shift the narrative. She knows how to stay within the boundaries, even as she quietly expands them. And that is a very particular and very powerful kind of power to exercise. It's not the power of open challenge, and it's not the power of dramatic confrontation. It's a power rooted in control, of timing, of understanding exactly what can be said and how it must be said. And it works. The warrant is never acted upon. The threat passes. Katherine remains queen. And crucially, she continues. She does not abandon her intellectual interests. She does not withdraw from the world of ideas she has created. Instead, she carries on with a sense of what is at stake. And so when we think of Katherine Parr's role in the English Reformation, we need to think about it in these terms, not as a dramatic turning point and not as a single moment of transformation, but as a sustained effort, a continual process, a careful, intelligent, and at times precarious act of preservation. If Anne Boleyn made reform visible, then Katherine Parr helped to make it survivable. She ensured that it did not disappear when circumstances changed. She created a space in which it could endure, and in doing so, she made it possible that Elizabeth would later inherit a very different world. But Katherine does not stop at preservation, she goes further, because she does something that takes reform out of the court and into the wider world. She writes, and more importantly, she publishes. And that distinction really matters because writing in the 16th century was contained but absolutely not unusual. Many people wrote letters, prayers, translations, and reflections, and these circulate privately within households among trusted circles. But publication is something else. Publication is by nature public. It means reach and it means influence. And in 1545, Katherine Parr produced a work entitled Prayers or Meditations. This is a printed book. It's designed for a small group, not for a small group, but for a wide audience. And it is intended to be read, used, and absorbed. And it becomes one of the most popular devotional texts of the mid-Tudor period. It is reprinted, it circulates widely, it enters homes, and it shapes how people pray. Now, that alone would be highly significant, but what makes it extraordinary is this. It is published under her own name. And that is a moment worth pausing on because Katherine Parr becomes the first queen to publish in her own name in a book in English. Not anonymously, not disguised, not quietly, but publicly, deliberately, confidently. And in doing so, she crosses a boundary because she moves from being a participant in a religious culture to being a creator of it. She's no longer simply engaging with ideas, she is shaping them. She's contributing to the language through which faith is expressed. She's helping to define what English devotional life looks like. And that is a profound shift because it changes what a queen can be. No longer a consort, no longer a political figure, but an intellectual presence, a published voice, a woman's whose words carry authority. And then Catherine goes further. In 1547, she publishes The Lamentation of a Sinner. This is a very different kind of text, where prayers or meditations is in many ways scriptural and conventional. The Lamentations of a Sinner is personal. It is reflective. It is at times strikingly direct. Here, Catherine writes about sin, about redemption, about faith, and about her own spiritual experience. And she does so in a voice that is so unmistakably her own. There is an absolute confidence in this book, a clarity, a sense that she is not simply repeating established ideas, but engaging in them, interpreting them, and making them her own. And again, we have to recognize how unusual this is. This is not expected. Queen publishing theological reflection in English is in this period a bold act. And it is not without risk, because even after the crisis of the arrest warrant has passed and her husband has died, the environment remains uncertain. Religious identity is still contested. The boundaries of acceptable belief are shifting, and Catherine is operating within that uncertainty. She can shape the religious and cultural life of a nation, and those ideas matter because they do not disappear with her. They become part of the world that Elizabeth grows up in. Elizabeth absorbs this example, she reads this work, she reproduces it, and crucially, we see in later speeches, in her letters, in her extraordinary command of rhetoric, in her understanding that words can do more than communicate. They can persuade, inspire, and control. This is where Catherine's influence becomes visible in a very particular way, because Elizabeth does not publish devotional texts in the same way, but she does something equally powerful. She uses language as a tool of rule. She crafts speeches carefully. She controls her voice. She understands how words shape perception, and that understanding does not emerge in isolation. It is part of a broader cultural shift, a shift in which Katherine Parr plays a central role. So when we think about Catherine as a writer, we should not think of her simply as an author of books. We should think of her as a figure who changes the possibilities of authorship itself, who expands the boundaries of what women, what queens can do, who demonstrate that intellectual authority is not limited by gender. Catherine's influence is not only expressed through words, it is also expressed through images, through patronage, through the shaping of culture in a visual world as well as an intellectual one. The Tudor court is not only an intellectual space. It is a place where power can be seen as much as it is spoken, where authority is communicated not only through words, but through images, through clothing, through display, and through art. And that brings us back very deliberately to what is behind me, the rainbow portrait. Because this painting is not simply a portrait, it is a carefully constructed statement of identity. Everything in it is doing something. Everything is communicating. Elizabeth is not just a queen, she is the center of a world. Now, this kind of image making does not appear suddenly. It is the result of a culture, a tradition, a way of thinking about power and representation that develops over time. And we can trace that trend backwards, and we find ourselves back again with Anne Boleyn and her predecessor, Catherine of Aragon, because these formidable queens understood the importance of image. Anne patronized artists such as Hans Holbein the Younger, whose work helped to define the visual language of the Tudor court. Catherine was connected to the Horembout family, who brought with them the continental traditions of portrait and illumination, and Anne becomes their patron too. Through these connections, these women helped to shape a court culture in which image mattered, in which you were seen as part of how you ruled. Now, Katherine Parr inherited that world, but as we have already seen, she does not simply inherit it, she develops it. Her court becomes a place where intellectual and artistic life exists side by side, where books are read and images are created, where ideas are expressed not only through text but through visual culture. And importantly, Catherine's patronage reflects her broader interests. She supports scholars, translators, and thinkers, but she also engages with artistic production. She fosters an environment in which creativity is valued, and this includes significantly the employment of women artists. Because two of the most important figures to emerge in this period are Susanna Hornbout and Levine Teerlinck, truly remarkable Renaissance artists, women working within highly competitive world of the Tudor court portraiture. Teerlinck followed in the tradition of the Hornbout family, and she became central in the production of portrait miniatures at court. Now, of course, portrait miniatures like this are not large public statements like this one. They are immediate, they are portable, personal, but they are no less important. They are part of the same visual language. They shape how individuals are seen, remembered, and also understood. And Teerlinck's presence at court is quite significant because it tells us that the artistic world of Katherine Parr is part of a not exclusively male network. There is space, limited but real, for female participation, for female creativity, for women not only to be depicted, but to create art. And that really matters because it reinforces a broader cultural shift, a shift in which women are not simply passive figures within court culture, but active contributors. Now, Katherine Parr herself is not commissioning grand symbolic portraits in the way that Elizabeth later will, but her queenship operates in a different context, with different constraints. But what she does do is help to sustain a courtly culture in which art matters, in which image matters, in which the visual expression of identity and authority is taken seriously. And this is the environment in which Elizabeth grows up in, the world she inherits, a world shaped by Anne Boleyn's early patronage, developed through Katherine Parr's careful cultivation of intellectual and artistic life, and absorbed, transformed, and expanded by Elizabeth herself. Because when Elizabeth becomes queen, she takes this understanding of image and elevates it to an entirely different level. She does not simply participate in visual culture, she controls it, she shapes it, she standardizes it. Her portraits are not random or incidental, they are deliberate, they are carefully managed, repeated and recognizable. They create a constant image of queenship, one that emphasizes youth, authority, wisdom, and almost divine status. And works like the Rainbow Portrait are the culmination of that process. These are not just paintings, they are political tools. They communicate power and they reinforce identity. And Elizabeth understands that from Katherine Parr and Anne Boleyn. So when we stand here looking at this extraordinary image of Elizabeth, we aren't just seeing her, we're seeing the culmination of a tradition, one that began with Anne, one that is sustained, developed by Katherine Parr, and one that Elizabeth herself perfects. And this is why Katherine Parr matters, because without her, that line is broken. Without her, the transformation from Anne's court to Elizabeth's reign is far less certain, far less stable, and far less coherent. Katherine Parr is the bridge, not only between ideas, but in ways of seeing, in ways of expressing power, ways of shaping identity. And it is here in this room, in front of this image, that legacy becomes truly visible. And so when we think about Katherine Parr, we need to move beyond that familiar description, beyond the idea of a survivor beyond the final wife, because that is not where her significance lies. Her significance lies in connection, in continuity, and in influence. She is the bridge, the figure who links two of the most famous women in English history, not simply through chronology, but through ideas, through culture, through the shaping of a world. And it is perhaps simply best to put it like this. If Anne Boleyn helped to light that flame, Katherine Parr kept it alive, long enough, carefully enough, intelligently enough for Elizabeth to carry it into history. And standing here at Hatfield in front of this extraordinary image, we are all standing in the light of that flame. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. That was an incredible portrait of Katherine Parr as a woman, but also as that, as you say, influential bridge setting the stage for Elizabeth's reign. Our final speaker this evening is Nicola Tallis, an independent author and historian and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She's worked as a curator, researcher, and lecturer, and specializes in the use of jewels in late medieval and Tudor England. Nicola has made numerous television and radio appearances, including on BBC's Who Do You Think You Are?, Channel 5's The Vikings and the Gunpowder Plot, and Channel 4's Frankie Boyle's Farewell to the Monarchy. She is the author of 5 books, and her latest, Young Elizabeth, Princess, Prisoner, Queen, was named Book of the Week in The Times. Nicola is going to discuss Princess Elizabeth's involvement in the Seymour scandal at the age of 15, an incident well documented in our archives here and which features prominently in the exhibition next door. Please welcome Nicola.
Well, thank you so much. What a huge privilege it is to be here this evening speaking after 2 amazing talks, no pressure, and in such an iconic setting as well. I first came to Hatfield, my parents brought me here for my 15th birthday, and I remember being utterly amazed. And if you had told me then that I'd be privileged enough to speak here now, I'd never have believed it. So thank you very much for having me. And I'd really like to take you back to an episode in time that happened right here at Hatfield in the cold winter of 1549. On the 22nd of January, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt arrived at Hatfield to confront a bewildered Elizabeth, half-sister to Edward VI, over her involvement with the disgraced Lord Admiral Thomas Seymour, who at that moment lay languishing in the Tower of London, having been arrested for treason. Tyrwhitt was already known to Elizabeth because he'd been a key member of Katherine Parr's household, but there were no niceties to be had now. Instead, to her horror, Elizabeth now found herself under suspicion of intriguing with Thomas Seymour. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Here's Thomas Seymour, who it transpired had hoped to marry her. Sir Robert had been ordered by Edward VI's council and the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, brother to Thomas, to extract a confession from her regarding her dealings with him. Elizabeth was about to embark on the most treacherous period of her life to date, and it happened right here at Hatfield. If it was shown that she had knowledge and approval of Thomas's plans to marry her without the council's consent, then she too would be implicated in the treason of which he now stood accused. If such a thing could be proven, the consequences Elizabeth faced could be dire, perhaps even fatal. What's more, the story that I'm about to tell you is one that, if you haven't already seen, you will have the opportunity to largely see with your own eyes, because part of it unfolds in the letters that are on display in tonight's pop-up exhibition, which chart this terrifying time in Elizabeth's life, and these are just a few of them. It all came about in the aftermath of Henry VIII's death in January 1547, when Elizabeth, who was then 13, had joined her stepmother Katherine Parr's household at Chelsea. Within weeks of Henry VIII's death, Katherine Parr secretly married Thomas Seymour, uncle to the young King Edward VI. And when news of the wedding became public, Thomas moved to join the household at Chelsea, where he assumed the role of stepfather and guardian to Elizabeth and won the affection of key members of her household, including her governess, Kate Astley. Also under Thomas's wardship at this time were Elizabeth's cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who was much admired by Mildred Cecil. But Jane didn't join Thomas at Chelsea and instead seems to have remained primarily at Seymour Place. Having moved to Chelsea, it wasn't long before Thomas, partially entrusted with Elizabeth's care, took advantage of the teenager's proximity, and his relationship with his new charge took a highly inappropriate turn. What happened is related in part in the letters on display this evening, and in many respects, they make for chilling reading. Thanks to the later confession of Elizabeth's devoted governess, Kate Astley, each page of which she has signed, so perhaps you'll be able to see that at the bottom, she signed her name there, Katherine Astley. We know that very soon after Thomas arrived at Chelsea, he, and I quote, would come many mornings into Elizabeth's chamber, sometimes before she had risen. On the occasions when he found her up, he would bid her good morning and, I quote again, strike her upon the back or on the buttocks familiarly, and so go forth through to his lodgings, and sometime go through to the maidens, Elizabeth's ladies, and play with them, and so go forth. If Elizabeth was still in bed, though, he would put open the curtains and bid her good morrow and make as though he would come at her. In response, she would go further into the bed so that he could not come at her. Elizabeth, who would turn 14 in September, was highly impressionable, but she must have realised that coming from such an unacceptable source as her stepmother's husband, Thomas's behaviour went well beyond the bounds of propriety. But she was also intrigued by this handsome older man who showed her such attention. And to begin with, she seems to have been genuinely attracted to him, the equivalent of a teenage crush, although she would never openly acknowledge as much. The morning visits continued, and as Thomas entered Elizabeth's chamber one morning in what had become his usual habit, he found that she was still in bed. Unfazed by the presence of Kate Astley, Thomas seized upon Elizabeth's vulnerability as she roused herself from sleep and boldly strove to have kissed her in her bed. For Kate Astley, this was too much, and horrified, she bade him go away for shame. Yet the morning calls carried on. Before long, however, Elizabeth herself recognised that Thomas had gone too far. She began to feel alarmed and tried desperately to avoid his advances. Given that he held a key to every room in the house, this became increasingly challenging. Hearing the lock turn in her door one morning and knowing that Thomas was about to enter, an anxious Elizabeth ran out of her bed to her maidens and then went behind the curtain of the bed. By now, those around Elizabeth were also fully aware of Thomas's behaviour and speaking of it amongst themselves. Kate Astley, who hadn't witnessed this latest incident, had heard of it from Elizabeth's gentleman porter, perhaps began to recognise that she hadn't done enough to protect her teenage charge, and she realised that Thomas was putting Elizabeth's reputation at risk. Kate's later confession reveals that she decided to take matters into her own hands and confront him. Approaching him in the gallery one day, Elizabeth's lady mistress warned Thomas that these things were complained of, and my lady was evil spoken of. But rather than listening to Kate's grievances, Thomas exploded in a fit of rage. "God's precious soul," he cried. He would tell his brother, the Lord Protector, how he'd been slandered. Furious at being rebuked by a member of Elizabeth's household, he would not leave it, he retorted, for he meant no evil. He had no intention of curbing his conduct. It's difficult not to judge Thomas's behaviour through modern eyes, which, given his age and position of power, would consider it child abuse. But in the 16th century, though such actions would have been deemed highly inappropriate, popular judgment wouldn't have labelled it in the same way. Concepts of maturity and ideals of behaviour were different 500 years ago, and of greater concern was the potential damage Thomas could inflict upon Elizabeth's reputation. She was, after all, the king's sister and the daughter of the great King Henry VIII. In royal circles, unmarried women were expected to be both modest and chaste, beyond all reproach. Any hint of scandal could ruin a woman's good name, and with it, all prospects of an advantageous marriage. By the summer of 1547, when the household moved to Hamworth, Katherine Parr too knew of her husband's behaviour. Here, Thomas's morning visits showed no signs of abating, though Elizabeth did her best to avoid them, taking care to ensure that she was always up by the time that Thomas reached her chamber. There were only 2 occasions that Kate Astley could recall when Elizabeth had not yet risen, and on both of these, Thomas was accompanied by Katherine Parr. Kate would later claim that she had told the Queen of Seymour's behaviour, but that Katherine made a small matter of it to me. Nevertheless, whether because of this conversation or her own aroused suspicions, or to satisfy herself that her husband's behaviour towards her stepdaughter was nothing more than innocent fun, Katherine decided that she would join Thomas during his regular visits to Elizabeth's chamber. Whatever misgivings she may have had about the situation, she was apparently prepared to turn a blind eye, even to join in. Kate Astley remembered that once, when Thomas and Katherine arrived for a joint visit to Elizabeth's chamber, the pair tickled my Lady Elizabeth in the bed. Kate anxiously confided in Thomas Seymour's servant John Harrington that my lord and the Queen came divers times to my Lady Elizabeth's chamber, which was well taken of by everybody. But my lord came sometime without the Queen, which of some was misliked. In other words, the visits were deemed acceptable with Katherine's presence, but when Thomas came alone, eyebrows were unsurprisingly raised. Though she may not have admitted as much in public, Katherine's suspicions about the nature of the relationship between her husband and her stepdaughter were becoming progressively stronger. Matters came to a head when one day Katherine came upon Thomas and Elizabeth alone, he having her in his arms. Understandably, Katherine, who was now pregnant with her first child, was horrified and an argument ensued. As a result of this, Elizabeth left the household in the spring of 1548 under a dark cloud. She would never see Katherine again, for just days after the birth of her child, on the 5th of September, Katherine died. Elizabeth would later confess that shortly after Katherine Parr's death, whilst she herself lay sick, Kate Astley urged her to write to Thomas to have comforted him of his sorrow in a gesture that he would doubtless appreciate because he had been my friend in the Queen's time. Elizabeth had just passed her 15th birthday, and though young, was learning from her past encounters. She was wise enough to ignore Kate's counsel, telling her that she believed such a letter to be unnecessary. In Katherine Parr's lifetime, although Kate Astley had not taken enough action to keep her charge safe, she had been anxious to protect Elizabeth's reputation throughout the goings-on at Chelsea and Hanworth. But she herself had also fallen victim to Thomas Seymour's charms and was more than a little fond of him. So much so that Elizabeth later admitted that her lady mistress had spoken to me of him many times. Now, Kate perceived an opportunity for Elizabeth, telling her, "He that would fain have had you before he married the Queen will now come to woo you." Though Elizabeth agreed, she knew full well that the council would not consent to it. And that was the salient point. Conversations of this kind were dangerous, for both Elizabeth and Kate Astley knew that given her royal status, the council's consent was essential to any marriage that Elizabeth made, and it was certainly never going to be granted to Thomas Seymour. Kate later confessed that her own husband hath divers times warned her to take heed, for he'd heard that Elizabeth did bear some affection for Thomas, and sometimes she would blush when he was spoken of. But Kate didn't listen. Likewise, though Elizabeth had previously done her best to distance herself from him, her entanglement with Thomas would become infinitely worse. Gossip would soon begin to circulate in London that Thomas was looking to marry Elizabeth, and Elizabeth herself would later recall that it was said that my Lord Admiral should marry me. Perhaps prematurely, she would dismiss this tittle-tattle as London news. Matters were not helped by the fact that her cofferer, Thomas Parry here, visited Seymour on a number of occasions during which Seymour made inquiries about Elizabeth's finances and her household. Marriage, it seemed, was very much on his mind. Likewise, Kate Astley spoke frequently of Thomas to Elizabeth, the latter of whom did nothing to dismiss it. Elizabeth seemingly knew of Thomas's feelings and intentions towards her and appeared to show an interest in return. With Thomas now a free man, her attitude towards him seems to have changed since the days spent at Chelsea and Hanworth, when she'd done her best to avoid him, and her head and her heart seemed torn. But in her head, she must have known that marriage could never be a genuine possibility. Matters, though, were about to be taken out of her hands. On the evening of the 16th of January, 1549, an intruder broke into the king's apartments at the Palace of Whitehall, killing the king's dog in the process. Whoever had done so fled the scene, and suspicion immediately landed on Thomas. By 8 o'clock the following evening, he found himself on his way to the Tower, suspected of attempting to kidnap his nephew, the king, and topple his brother, the Lord Protector, at the same time. Learning that he had been arrested, in their haste to disassociate themselves, his former friends, colleagues, and employees were all eager to supply evidence against him. Crucially, one of his servants made no effort to conceal the fact that his master had been visited on several occasions by Thomas Parry, cofferer to the Lady Elizabeth. Elizabeth's name was now dragged into Thomas's treason. When Sir Robert Tyrwhitt arrived here at Hatfield that winter, he revealed to Elizabeth that not only had Thomas Seymour been arrested, but that so too had two of her most devoted servants, Kate Astley and Thomas Parry. In his report to Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, Tyrwhitt told him that Elizabeth was marvellous abashed as she read the terrible news and did weep very tenderly a long time in her distress. She knew full well that Kate and Parry possessed knowledge that could land them all in a great deal of trouble. Elizabeth, though, told Sir Robert that she couldn't remember much, but that she would reveal to him everything that she knew. In truth, however, she had no intention of doing so. Admitting only that she had written to Thomas Seymour to press the suit of her chaplain, Edmund Allen, Elizabeth was prepared to reveal very little more of any import. While Sir Robert listened as Elizabeth disclosed these minor details, he found himself growing increasingly frustrated, for he knew that this was not the full story. When she'd said her piece, Sir Robert urged Elizabeth to blame the doings with Thomas on her servants. But she will not confess any practice by Mistress Astley or the cofferer. Sir Robert sensed that the task of convincing Elizabeth to admit to her full dealings with Thomas Seymour would not be easy, and he was right. For the time being, Elizabeth would admit nothing further. Nevertheless, as Sir Robert Tyrwhitt composed a letter to the Lord Protector, he made his opinion clear. I do see it in her face that she is guilty. Yet he also admitted she will abide more storms before blaming anything on her servants. In the days that followed, much to his frustration, Sir Robert found that Elizabeth was prepared to reveal very little else. By the 28th of January, he'd become exasperated and was convinced that Elizabeth must have made a secret promise with Astley and Parry, never to confess till death. If this was the case, then in Sir Robert's view, the only two who could extract the truth from Elizabeth were the King and the Lord Protector. He was quickly becoming exhausted in the attempt. That same day, Elizabeth herself also wrote to the Protector directly, and you can see this letter next door. And in this, she thanked him for his gentleness and goodwill towards me. Patently trying to win his good graces, she acknowledged that as an earnest friend, he had counselled her to reveal all that she knew, which she did willingly, so she told him. But in reality, this was very little, for she merely repeated everything that she'd already told Robert Tyrwhitt, insisting that in regards to Kate Astley's wish for her to marry Thomas, the Lady Mistress would never have me marry without the consent of the King's Majesty, your Graces, and the councils. Playing on her piety, in this letter, Elizabeth declared that everything she said had been the truth, whereof my conscience beareth me witness, which I would not for all earthly things offend in anything, for I know I have a soul to save. If she remembered anything further, though, she promised that she would write or else ask Sir Robert Tyrwhitt to do so. She was nevertheless horrified to hear from Sir Robert, doubtless in a further attempt to sway her into a confession, that unsavoury rumours were spreading that I am in the Tower and with child by my Lord Admiral. Elizabeth was always sensitive about her reputation and popularity with the people, and she took this final opportunity to plead with the Lord Protector. My lord, these are shameful slanders, for the which, besides the great desire I have to see the King's Majesty, I shall most heartily desire your lordship that I may come to the court after your first determination, that I may show myself there as I am. She was desperate to prove her innocence, but her pleas fell on deaf ears, and Elizabeth remained here at Hatfield. In the Tower, pressure was being brought to bear on Elizabeth's servants, Kate Astley and Thomas Parry. Both were kept in stringent conditions, and so it was little wonder that they were both paralysed with fear. It was Parry who cracked first, admitting that he had talked with Thomas about Elizabeth and her estates. Kate Astley, meanwhile, would utter nothing. Yet when she was brought face to face with Parry, who declared his confession, she was horrified. Though she called him a false wretch, berating him for divulging all, she was now left with no alternative but to do the same. She buckled under the pressure of the course of her 3 examinations, each account being written by the principal secretary, Sir Thomas Smith. And here you can see these are Kate's confessions. All of her own dealings and those that Elizabeth had had with Thomas Seymour were revealed. The details of the early morning romps came spilling out, and Kate admitted that she had spoken to Elizabeth divers times of a marriage between her and Thomas Seymour, though she was adamant that she'd never wished for such a thing without the consent of the council. Now that Kate and Parry had revealed all, the only thing that remained was to obtain a confession from Elizabeth herself. Back here at Hatfield, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt continued to interrogate Elizabeth, but had progressed no further. However, when the confessions of Kate Astley and Parry were delivered into his hands, they provided him with exactly what he needed. As Elizabeth was familiar with both of her servants' writing, when she witnessed their confessions with her own eyes, she knew that they have both confessed all they know. On the 5th of February, I'm not going to read all of this to you or ask you to read it. I'm going to roughly tell you what it says. But on the 5th of February, Sir Robert advised the Protector that Elizabeth had been much abashed and half breathless when reading the confession of her lady mistress. Leaving her to mull over what she had read, Sir Robert managed to extract her promise that the following day she will call all things to her remembrance. Sure enough, Elizabeth cracked. She began to set out her confession, in which she outlined Kate Astley's indiscreet comments about Thomas Seymour and Thomas's questioning of Parry in regards to her affairs, begging to be forgiven if she'd forgotten anything, and assuring the Lord Protector that if she should remember anything more, then I will send you word of them as they come to my mind. You can see this confession in the exhibition next door, and it's a really interesting document in many ways because, as you can see, Elizabeth began writing it in her own hand, but half a line into the second paragraph, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt takes over. We don't know why. Was it at his instigation, having perhaps become frustrated by Elizabeth, or was she taken unwell, as she often was? We simply don't know. But one final paragraph in Elizabeth's hand appears at the end, and here she signs her name too. We do know that Robert Tyrwhitt wasn't fully convinced by the confession, maintaining his belief that there had been some kind of collusion between Elizabeth, Kate, and Parry, and he told the Protector so when he forwarded this to him. But he recognised that Elizabeth would not admit anything that implicated her servants. They all sing one song, he grumbled. If Elizabeth hoped that with her own confession and those of Kate and Parry, matters were resolved, then she was sorely mistaken. Though she would no longer face the daily interrogations from Sir Robert, much to her dismay, he remained here at Hatfield, overseeing the running of her household. Unbeknown to her, though, on a personal level, the worst was now over, and though Kate Astley and Thomas Parry were both eventually released from the Tower, neither of them were immediately allowed to return to her. As for Thomas Seymour, 33 charges of treason were levelled at him, including that he planned to wed Elizabeth without the consent of the council. His fate was a foregone conclusion, and on the 20th of March, he was executed on Tower Hill. It wasn't a clean death, and it took 2 blows of the axe to sever his head. His brutal removal brought this chapter of Elizabeth's life to a terrifying end, but it was one that she would never forget. Just 5 years later, when Elizabeth had become entangled in the Wyatt Rebellion, she referenced Thomas Seymour's fate in a letter written to her half-sister, Mary I, in which she begged not to be sent to the Tower. The experience had made its mark on her, and during her time under interrogation here at Hatfield, she'd learned some important lessons. I'd like to end by reminding you all that as we sit in this beautiful space where we can see Elizabeth's iconic portrait, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that she survived the Seymour scandal and, of course, eventually became Queen. But the letters that you can see in tonight's exhibition are a reminder that in the winter of 1549, as Elizabeth and her servants faced interrogation, none of them had any idea that queenship lay in Elizabeth's future, or indeed that any of them would survive. These letters mark a pivotal moment in the story of England and of a dangerous time that played out right here at Hatfield. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for telling that really harrowing story from Elizabeth's childhood, frankly. It's a shocking thing to have to go through at such a young age, and a very, very mature theme to have to deal with. And it clearly really shaped Elizabeth as a person going forward and as a queen. We now have some time for questions from the audience, if any have been percolating in your heads throughout the evening. We have a roving microphone that Georgina has at the back that will be coming around, so please do wait until the microphone reaches you before speaking. But I am going to just ask one question to kick us off whilst you think about your questions. So you all have engaged in quite a lot of scholarship of the Tudor period and have engaged with primary sources quite a lot. I wondered if you could each tell us about a specific primary source that either you found a very exciting discovery in or which really spoke to you on a deep level.
That's a great question. I mean, the books of hours for me are my babies in terms of research. They've revealed so much to me. Those hidden inscriptions it's one of the most incredible moments of my career to have seen those for the first time and to examine them under ultraviolet light. It was just unlike anything I've experienced. But also the discovery that you briefly mentioned of Cromwell's Book of Hours, Thomas Cromwell's book, which I worked on with Owen and Heaver's curator, Alison Palmer, where we discovered that the book in Holbein's famous portrait of Thomas Cromwell, there's a bejeweled book front and centre of that portrait, and we found that very book in a library in Cambridge, in the Wren Library in Trinity College, and it's the only item of any of Holbein's paintings to survive to the present day. So again, having that tangible link to the past is a real highlight for me. I know it was for you as well.
Yeah, very much so. I adored working with that project. It was incredible. But I recently did some work with a pamphlet that was produced in 1533 by a printer called Wynkyn de Worde. Mm-hmm. And it's a piece of propaganda, essentially, that was created to give to normal people, whoever they are, to promote the idea that Anne was the rightful queen via a discussion of her coronation. And on the front of it is a woodcut, which previously had sort of been explained as a generic court scene, but which I have worked with another scholar to identify actually as three images of Anne and Henry together. Contemporary images of Anne are quite rare. There are only a handful of them. So to be able to add three more to the mix, even as crude as they are, was a real joy.
Absolutely.
I would say that mine was the one that I showed at the end, Elizabeth's confession in regards to the Seymour scandal. And I think it's not just what she says, but it is that the fact that, as I said, she begins writing it and then Robert Tyrwhitt takes over, and we don't know why that is. And I just think that is a really very tangible piece of history. I can almost imagine Elizabeth sitting down to write that, and suddenly she either feigns a headache or has a real headache, or Robert Tyrwhitt becomes exasperated and snatches the quill from her. And I just think that element of mystery around that one document is really something that's quite intriguing.
His handwriting is dreadful.
I know.
She had much
It's
nicer
atrocious.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's atrocious.
I was saying to Nicola earlier, these are official reports he's writing. You'd think he might, try a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But no, I think you've all hit the nail on the head absolutely there. Archives and primary sources are that tangible link to the past. You're interacting with something that these very people interacted with, which is what you can see next door. We have those testimonies written by Elizabeth. She actually sat there with those papers, with that quill, and put those words to paper. So we are very lucky in what we do. Okay, questions from the audience, please. Don't be shy. We have to be so. Yes. The microphone is on its way, galloping down.
Thank you all for that. That was wonderful. A question about the first talk, the book. Was there any significance as to what page of the book they signed their bits on? Did it sort of feed back to anything particular?
Yes, it's a really brilliant question, and undoubtedly there would have been a significance. When people wrote in books, which was very common for people to inscribe books of hours in particular, they became almost a diary for people to record important messages or dates of birth, etc. And there was always a significance. It was always a conscious decision to attach your name to a specific page. Often the calls are for remembrance, specifically in relation to prayers that are on that page, or underneath litanies of saints if their name is related to a saint. So as their namesake, they will attach it there. So yes, they're all in relation to either images or prayers that they specifically are requiring or requesting remembrance for. In the other Book of Hours that we have at Hever, Anne's manuscript, which dates to 1450, it's an incredible item. She's written inside that as well. And she's written a famous Le Temps viendra, the time will come, and that's underneath an illumination of the Last Judgment. So she's clearly thinking about those great eternal themes of time and judgment. So yeah, there's often a link. It's a good question.
Okay, next question. Yes, microphone's on its way.
I've noticed before, and I saw it with the images that came up tonight, there's a real similarity between the portraits of Elizabeth and Katherine Parr. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on whether that is like a Tudor Snapchat filter, and they're all sort of got a trend of how they look, which we've seen in other areas of history, and how much of it could be Elizabeth potentially channeling a queen that she admired. And if it's possible to ask a second question, Instagram told me that it's one of our lovely speakers tonight's birthday this week. I didn't want to sort of name and shame. I was wondering which Tudor woman you believe would give the birthday party.
Excellent question.
That's a really cool question. Shall I answer that first? Okay, I'm going to say a lady who is actually in this room at the back, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Yeah. And the best bit about it is that she doesn't look like she would throw a great party, but promise you, she absolutely would. Her accounts are full of payments for wine and singers and dancers. I'm sure we would be very well looked after and entertained. So I'd leave the party planning in her capable hands. Thank you.
If you want to see that portrait on your way out, it's just on this wall. It's the bottom right. I can't see her from here, but she is there. So have a look at her.
And yeah, to answer your question about the similarity, I think that's definitely possible. We actually see quite a few synergies between the portraiture of Elizabeth and Anne Boleyn as well, which you'd expect there to be a similarity visually. I think we can't discount the fact that they are dressed similarly too. But what they both practice and encourage is the use of patterns. So we know, for example, that Katherine Parr has multiple miniatures made of the same portrait that she can distribute to courtiers' friends. That's done, she's not sitting for all of them, it's done through a process of replication, and this is something incredibly important in Elizabeth's reign. She sits for very few portraits. She entrusts people like Hilliard to take a authorised portrait, which I'm sure she helps curate, and that is distributed. And we even know that artists could borrow items of clothing from the royal wardrobe to complete the portrait of Elizabeth, who's never sat for them. They've been given a face pattern and her clothes. So what I'm trying to suggest, I think, is that they are standardising, they're shaping their image. And you don't see that actually with Anne Boleyn that we're aware of, or Catherine of Aragon. I think it might be something that begins with Katherine Parr. So perhaps that is something that Elizabeth learns. She gets, interestingly, her later portraiture looks closer to her mother and to Katherine Parr. Her earlier portraiture looks much more like Henry. One of the portraits that you put up on screen is full face on, like the Holbein. And I don't think there's any sort of mistake in that. I think her legitimacy came through her father, and when she was accepted, her image softens slightly. So it's all about control, I think. Don't know if you agree.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Great questions. Okay, yes, microphone's on its way.
I heard a few rumours about Anne Boleyn. I mean, that she cheated on King Henry VIII, and that her daughter, Elizabeth I, wasn't really Henry VIII's daughter.
Lies and slander. Yeah.
Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn had a sixth finger. Is that true?
Also lies and slander, and actually a particularly relevant one for us, because we at Hever, one of the portraits of Anne that we were showing is known as the Hever Rose portrait, and it's recently undergone for the first time in its life scientific analysis, dendrochronology, paint analysis, a full testing. And the infrared scans showed on that image that her hands, you can see all 10 of her digits in that portrait, they were added for the first time into her iconography in that very portrait. And it's been dated to around 1583, which is the same time that those rumours of the sixth finger first started to circulate. So they absolutely post-date her lifetime. Those rumours were created by a Catholic propagandist called Nicholas Sander, and we think that that portrait is in a deliberate visual rebuttal of those rumours that were being spread. And we think they were actually to challenge the legitimacy of Elizabeth, who at that time was going through somewhat of a legitimacy crisis in her reign. So this was Elizabeth's way of, through art, using the power of art to show that her mother did not have six fingers, and therefore, as was the assumption, was not a witch.
Another great question. Yes, microphone's coming.
Obviously, the women we've been talking about tonight, they're all incredibly well educated, intelligent and wise. I was interested in their relationship with Henry VIII, and is there any history of his thought process, his thoughts about the women that you're talking about tonight? And also, would Henry go down in history as being thought of as intelligent and wise?
I think not as much as his wives were, I think, often. I think, yeah, particularly maybe three of them we know the most about in terms of their education, probably Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Katherine Parr, who are all incredibly bright and witty and charismatic. And I think in terms of Anne herself, she absolutely outshone Henry, unfortunately. But I think that was something he was drawn to. You know, I think he had a type. You could probably say he's drawn to these stubborn, brilliant, intelligent, highly educated women, particularly with Catherine and Anne, I think. But yeah, I don't know what you guys want to say as well.
Yeah, I think that Henry VIII is Prince Harry. He's never meant to be king, and he grows up in a woman's household. He doesn't grow up with Arthur, who's meant to be king. He grows up with very strong, formidable women, and he needs women in his life. It's why he's never without one, really. But he's given all of the tools, but I wouldn't say he necessarily excels in them. And as Kate mentioned, another of Henry and Anne's Book of Hours, is held in the British Library, and there are inscriptions from Anne and Henry. They're communicating to one another, and Anne's inscription is so much better than Henry's. Like it's so economical and witty, and it's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautifully composed. It's a lovely rhyming couplet, and Anne's very cautious with her words, and Henry is just, gushing essentially, and likening his pain to the wounds of Christ. Yeah. So it would be really interesting to see a different Henry in a world where he is meant to be king. He is given the better education, the princely education, and not the education of a spare. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it's very interesting when we look at Elizabeth as well, and her relationship with Henry. And we have in the British Library, we have the only surviving letter that was written by Elizabeth to her father, which is the preface of the New Year's gift that she gave him in 1545, when she's 12 years old. And it's intended to flatter Henry by saying how wonderful he is, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's also intended to showcase Elizabeth's own position as Henry's daughter. I think in that preface, she refers to herself as being his daughter about 10 times, just to sort of really hammer the point home. And it's also written in 3 languages, French, Italian and Latin. So Elizabeth, as I say, she's 12 years old at this time. She's really trying to showcase to her father that her intelligence, that the education that he's invested in for her are paying off, but that she's not quite as clever as he is. So she knows, she knows very much what to do. She recognises that her position in life is very much dependent on Henry as well. And, later, the year before she becomes queen in 1557, the Venetian ambassador says that Elizabeth prides herself in her father and glories in him. And I think that was very much a deliberate public strategy that she put out, that she is her father's daughter, and that, she is as clever as her father, but doesn't necessarily want to show that during his lifetime.
Okay, next question. Yes, there's a hand over this way. Can you raise your hand higher so we can see it? Oh, there's 2. 1, 2.
Hi, so it's just for the first talk. I've always been interested in ways that Elizabeth potentially tried to learn more about her mum, because I've always assumed that whilst Henry was alive, she wasn't really able to pursue that. But you mentioned that there was evidence of her actively trying to learn about her mum when she was queen. And I just wondered what evidence that was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd recommend a brilliant book by Professor Tracy Borman, which is all about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth's relationship. But there are so many ways that Elizabeth tried to feel closer to her mother. She promoted all of her Boleyn relatives, so all of her cousins by Mary Boleyn, by Anne's sister. She was very close to all of them. She adopted Anne's emblems, like her heraldry, her falcon. She sort of promoted herself as the phoenix, literally a phoenix emblem that had risen from her mother's ashes. There were all these ways that she tried to connect back to her mother and project her forwards. And of course, the famous checkers ring, which has a kind of jewel portrait. You flip it open and it's a portrait of Elizabeth and another woman. It's been actually posed, potentially it's Katherine Parr. I think it's Anne. And is a way, again, that Elizabeth kept Anne very close, literally on her person. So I think it was difficult in some ways for Elizabeth to publicly scream about her love for her mother as much as she perhaps did for her father, politically, obviously with the circumstances of Anne's downfall. But what Tracy writes about in her book is one of the first things Elizabeth did was to essentially declare her mother was the rightful queen, to support her parents' marriage. And in one of the portraits I showed of Elizabeth that we have at Hever, a bit like the rainbow portrait, which is covered in symbolism, this one is covered in honeysuckles and acorns, and they were the marital symbols of Anne and Henry, so of her parents. So she's literally adorning herself in both of her parents in sort of quiet and unspoken ways, but also more proud and public ways too. So there's so many ways she felt close. I don't know if any others spring to your mind.
I was just going to add that although it was difficult for her to speak of her mother, and she does do that more times than you'd think, she receives a lot of information. So Matthew Parker becomes her Archbishop of Canterbury. Matthew Parker was Anne's chaplain, and she receives a lot of information via him. Alexander Elysius as well gives an account to Elizabeth. And of course, we start to see the birth of Anne the Martyr. And a lot of her history begins to be written during Elizabeth's reign. So while she wasn't necessarily able to speak openly about her, and very interestingly, science does tell us now that she might well have had a memory of her mother, even before she was 3 years old. And we know how precocious Elizabeth is. She actually notices that her status has been demoted. She asks why she is being called my lady and not my lady princess at that young age. So yes, she received a lot of information about Anne. And in order to do so, I think she needed to ask.
Yeah, I agree. And the only other thing that I would add is that quite often people remark upon the fact that, how could Elizabeth speak so favourably of her father, knowing that he had ordered the execution of her mother? And I mentioned the fact that we have to remember that Elizabeth is dependent on her father, as I said, for her position in life, but also, and I don't know what Kate Nolan think about this, my personal thought is that she very much blamed Thomas Cromwell for Anne's downfall and sort of removed her father from the line of blame. I think that she thought that her father had been wickedly convinced by Cromwell that Anne was guilty, and that is how she was able to emotionally separate Henry from that. So,
and the row behind.
A question about Elizabeth. Her relationship with Thomas Seymour obviously was very scandalous and very risky for her, and one that she was lucky to survive. Do you think that was responsible in any way for her future lack of trust in any male suitors? And obviously, she never went on to marry.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think actually a lot of her ideas about marriage had already taken shape by that point, because let's face it, Dad doesn't have a great track record. And Elizabeth, she did learn some very valuable lessons from her father about the way in which he treated and discarded his wives. By the time that Elizabeth is 8, she's not only lost her mother, but she's lost 3 stepmothers in terrible circumstances, one in childbirth, one by annulment, divorce, and another executed. So I think that, there's not a great precedent set to begin with, but I think that, and I think it's also important to say that I think that the Seymour scandal would never have played out in that way if Henry VIII had been alive at that time. Like, Thomas Seymour takes advantage of the fact that his nephew is a 9-year-old king, and he abuses that position of trust. There's no doubt about that. And I think that for a moment, we have to remember Elizabeth is incredibly vulnerable. She has got nobody to turn to for advice, for security or support in that situation, because her stepmother, Katherine Parr, is actively involved in that. So I think that, to go back to answering your question, I think she'd already learned some valuable lessons about the uncertainties of marriage by the time that the Seymour scandal plays out. But I think that really sort of hammered the point home, and Elizabeth had a moment where perhaps her heart took over and she was flattered by Seymour's attentions. But I think realistically, she realised that would never go any further. I don't know if you two agree with that.
Agree.
Yeah.
She had a myriad of reasons, I think, not to marry. Not least as well because in marrying, some of her own power as queen would have gone to her husband, and she would have lost some of that agency and autonomy. So I think that played a small part in her decision as well, though she was very good at the marriage game and sort of stringing along a lot of suitors for political uses, which was a big part of her power. But yes, I think definitely she'd seen a lot of bad examples of marriages and again of the danger of childbirth and stepmothers dying in childbirth. So yes, I think she had lots of reasons, but that was definitely one.
Yeah, just to pick up on the point you made there about a queen regnant losing power, there's only been one recognised queen regnant before her. Arguably, there's another, Jane, who refuses to make her husband king, very wisely. But, Mary's reign, her half-sister's Mary's reign was fundamentally reshaped by her marriage to Philip of Spain. I don't think the direction of the persecution of so-called heretics would have been as intense as it was without Philip's direction.
Yeah, great.
And I think Elizabeth saw all of this, saw how the power dynamic, fundamentally reshifted, and understood that marriage game could ultimately give her far more power. I think she must have recognised also that her father Henry had been the sort of pivot point between European power politics. He was continually flitting between Francis I and Charles V, and understood that being that pivot point gave him enormous power, even though England was, relatively small by comparison. So I think Elizabeth understood that by saying yes tentatively, but never following through on several occasions, was a better way of going forward for her.
She held the cards, didn't she?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, over here. Oh.
Can I just go for it? I'm quite now.
Actually, we've got the mic with someone else. They were quicker than me. We'll do two more questions then.
Hi, hello. I'm a guide here. Two questions really. One question from 1533 to 1536. Anne Boleyn's portrait, she wears the French cap. Obviously, she was educated in France, and so she showed this fashion of this rather curved, attractive style. So then, of course, when she's beheaded in 1536, Jane Seymour does not wear that French cap anymore. She goes back to the hooded cap that Catherine of Aragon wore. So, but I noticed by your lecture, you said there was sympathy between Katherine Parr and Anne Boleyn. So when we get back to Katherine Parr, she's wearing the French cap again. Is there any sort of connection with that?
So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but all of these queens wore all of these headdresses. And there are more images of Anne from her lifetime in the English fashion than there is the French. Moreover, it's not really a French fashion. It evolves from the lyre pipe. It's just called French, annoyingly, if I'm honest. Just as the English gable hood wasn't a term in the 16th century, it was called a bonnet and a frontlet. So what survives may look like a pattern, but in reality, from their finances, from their inventories, we know that all of these queens wore all of these fashions. It's unfortunately what survives appears to be a pattern, but isn't. I think is the best way of answering that. I don't know if you two agree.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, thank you. Just one more question. The palace was four-sided, and the south range is, we think, where Elizabeth had her rooms, etc. So was there a chapel? Did she worship, or did she worship in St. Etheldreda, the church?
Sorry, I didn't hear all the question. Was it, did she worship in St Etheldreda, the church?
Well, did she? I mean, the church is so close, but was the church just for the town of Hatfield, or did she worship in St Etheldreda, or did she worship in her own chapel, which I presume was in the south range of the old palace?
Yeah, I mean, we don't actually have any, not that I'm aware, we don't have any direct references to Elizabeth worshipping in St Etheldreda, but I think that it's highly probable given its proximity and also its links with members of her family. So, you know, her cousin, Frances Brandon, was christened there. So I think that it's highly probable that Elizabeth would have worshipped in St Etheldreda, but as far as I'm aware, we just don't have any direct evidence of that, confirmation of that. But I imagine that she probably would have used both her chapel here and the church as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Okay. Final question here.
Thank you. It's a final question and a half, because the half just needs a yes or no. So I'm intrigued by why Catherine married quite so quickly. And the obvious is to sort of make her safe, but I'm really intrigued a little bit if we could just do a little bit more on kind of why that was so quickly. And my second question that you might want to do at the end, as a child of Hatfield, and I lived here for 4 years, I can remember being dragged to the Great Oak, sat under it and told repeatedly, you need to, you know, take your time here because this is where she got told. So I'd like the yes or no to that one, because my mother would kill me if I went home without that. But what I'm really interested in is Catherine and why? Why so fast?
And I think love, unfortunately for her. We have good evidence that she wanted to marry him before Henry wanted to marry Catherine. So yes, I do unfortunately think it was for love. And I say unfortunately because I do think he broke her heart in the worst possible way. And I think also it's also quite important to recognise that what happened with Edward's regency wasn't meant to happen. Henry did not want the Seymours to take control. He wanted a regency council. And unfortunately, Edward Seymour took the role of Lord Protector, which Henry did not want. I think Catherine had wanted to be regent, expected to be regent. She had been named regent during Henry's reign and had done it incredibly well. So yes, I think it wasn't particularly seemly to be married quite as quickly as she was. But yeah, I think it was rooted in love.
I think they'd been waiting a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to sort of, I completely agree with everything that Owen said there. I used to curate at Sudeley Castle, and we have had a letter in the collection there where she says, where Catherine says to Seymour, basically, yes, I wanted to marry you before I married Henry, howbeit God withstood my will most vehemently. And so it is clear. And I think also, that is love is the only way that we can explain Catherine's role in the Seymour scandal, because to all other intents and purposes, as Owen demonstrated in his excellent talk, Catherine is an exemplary stepmother to Elizabeth. She instills her with so much knowledge, so much sort of autonomy, and then she sort of ruins it all really with her role in the Seymour scandal. And I think for me, the only way that we can explain that is through the depth of Catherine's feelings for Thomas Seymour, because she doesn't come out of that looking good. And I think that love is simply the only explanation for that.
The tree?
The tree.
Oh yeah, the tree. Oh no, I don't want to go first. I'm so sorry, no.
Yeah.
It's a lovely tree.
It's a lovely tree.
It really is.
And it's a wonderful romantic story and image, but yeah.
And it has a history itself,
It does.
But no.
Sweet. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming this evening. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Nicola, Owen, and Kate. And I want to thank you all as well for coming out to join us to learn about the incredibly, wow, it's really bright now, sorry. It's a terrible transition. But yes, so I wanted to highlight that we have our next two events of the Hatfield Park lecture series coming up in summer and autumn. So 24th of July, we have Hatfield House, Park and Gardens, then and now looking at the development of the house that we're all in just now, as well as the gardens and the historic parkland. And 25th of September, we have the art of collecting, which will look at the psychology of collecting and also focus on the rock crystal set in the Long Gallery, which you may have seen if you visited Hatfield House before. But it will focus on that set as the object that we're going to contextualize through the history of collecting. So please do join us for those. The tickets are available now, so don't hesitate to book in. And lastly, please do go have a second look at the exhibition. You have a few minutes to do that now in the new light that you can you can appreciate them in. But thank you very much and have a great evening.